Moving on now, the infected blood inquiry wrapped up, I believe, yesterday. Let me just remind you, it was a long-running public inquiry into what's been called, and I quote, and I'm reading because I want to get the facts right here. It's been called the worst treatment disaster in the history of the NHS. It heard its final evidence yesterday. A final report will be coming out a little later. To remind you, it's thought that tens of thousands of people were infected with HIV and hepatitis, and this was between 1970 and 1991. They were given contaminated drug or blood transfusion. Now, this inquiry started in 2018, so it's been going on for quite a while, reviews thousands of documents, heard testaments for 370 witnesses, and they're going to publish the formal conclusions. Let me just give you some facts. A total of 1,250 people with haemophilia and other bleeding disorders contracted HIV after being given a protein made from blood plasma known as factor VIII. Now, factor VIII was where they got it from was mainly from the United States, and they got it from prisoners and people that would otherwise not even been able to, legally give blood. About half of that group later died of an AIDS-related illness. As I said, the UK wasn't self-sufficient in factor VIII, so it was imported from at-risk groups in the United States who were paid to donate. Another 30,000 NHS patients probably contracted a virus, hepatitis C, through the same contaminated treatment, transfusions given after childbirth, for instance. 2,050 of that group later died of liver failure caused by Hep C. Children, 380 kids were infected with HIV, 1 in 3 of children, some toddlers. The rule goes, it goes on. They knew, governments knew, even back in 1983, this was flagged up. So, it's something that we've forgotten about. See, when these things go off the front pages, we forget about them. But there are hundreds of thousands of people, not just the people I've read out there, but their loved ones, their families, their kids, etc., who died as a result of that. Joining me now is Sue Threakall, who was personally affected by this. Sue, when you look at the figures like that, I've always said somebody's got to be a statistic. We always think, that poor people, it happened to them. Someone is living the hell of a statistic. One of those thousands of people is you. Tell us why you're not just a statistic. It actually happened to you and your loved ones. You've been affected by this personally.
Yeah, I remember saying in an interview shortly before Bob died, you never think it will happen to you, but it did happen to us. And I suppose we've all got this kind of self-made protective barrier around ourselves. We look at the news, we read the papers, and we think, that's Ukraine or that's the United States and it's nothing to do with me. And then suddenly, your whole world collapses around you. This thing happens, whatever it might be. And then you realise that actually this happens to just ordinary people.
Yeah. Well, tell us what happened to you. You mentioned Bob. Tell us, how this affected you and what happened.
Well, we were living a perfectly normal, probably some people would say boring life. I was a deputy head teacher at a local school. He was a civil servant. We got 3 children, 2 stepsons of mine from Bob's previous marriage and our own little boy. And as I said, just ordinary, boring. We'd go out for the occasional pub meal. We didn't go on foreign holidays. Bob liked DIY. We liked gardening, all that sort of domestic stuff. And then all of a sudden one day, we'd obviously heard about HIV. It was starting to filter through the press. And then he went to what was just a normal Thursday morning clinic appointment at his local hospital, where he was due to get the results of some blood tests. And he said, I'll meet you in your lunch hour and I'll let you know what they say. And he came to the school where I was working. I still remember, how you get these moments in life that you can take yourself back to and you're actually there, You're there. We must have been sitting in my car because I remember sitting in the driver's seat and I said, what did you say? What did they say? And he said, well, they said I've tested positive for HIV. And I said, well, does that imply? What does that mean? And he said, well, they don't know. And they said, we're to use protection when we have sex, and you're not to try and get pregnant for the next 2 or 3 years. And that was it. That was the only advice we were ever given.
But whoa. So Sue, did you think, because when we talk about these things affecting you, obviously it's physical, but mental health as well. Did you think, could he have cheated? Might he been secretly gay or anything like that? Not at that time.
No, and I mean, it wouldn't have entered my head anyway, but the fact that virtually every haemophiliac in his clinic had tested positive for it as well, you know.
Oh.
And then we had a letter from the hospital saying, will you please not discuss it at clinic, because it's a general haematology clinic. We don't want to upset the general haematology patients.
Whoa.
We were isolated.
So hang on, let me just, I just want to wrap my head around that. So you knew Bob had haemophilia. He went for his checkup. Next thing you know, they're telling him he's got HIV. Sorry, so that would that explains why you wouldn't think he'd cheated or anything. Because sorry, I didn't realise the haemophilia part. But then they tell you you're not allowed to discuss it with
at the clinic. It's
patients.
Like some. So we were immediately isolated from the other patients and from any peer support that we might otherwise have had.
Oh my gosh. Did you think at that time that it was just one thing in one clinic? You know, because you wouldn't have been able to comprehend. No one would have been able to comprehend. I can't reading this, that all over the country with all sorts of people, this was happening to them as well.
Well, I suppose, again, that filtered out gradually. I mean, what we now know is that a whole generation of haemophilia patients were infected with hepatitis C. Out of that generation, a quarter of them were also infected with HIV, out of which only a quarter of those are left alive today. In other words, 3/4 of the HIV haemophiliacs are dead.
And most of those died in the I was going to say, in the days when they didn't have the sorts of medicines and treatments that they've got now, this was way back in the 80s. And when we only, the average person, we'd only heard snippets about HIV. But also, let's talk about the stigma around HIV at that time. The absolute stigma. What I mean, wow.
Yeah. I must admit, it's something I never kind of bought into, because for our family, I just thought, we've done nothing wrong. This has been inflicted on us, and I don't see why we should hide away. We were very fortunate in that friends either dropped off or they stuck with us, and we didn't actually have many problems. I do remember my boss at work, who was a lovely, lovely man. He was a great head teacher, called me in one day and we were discussing it. And I was just about to rip off a letter to the Birmingham Evening Mail about it. And he said, if I were you, I wouldn't tell too many people. And I thought, no way, you know, somebody's got to come out and say this is what's happening to these people. But I know one family who had AIDS scum written across their house in 3-foot high letters. I know of families where their children were kicked out of school when they found out their father was HIV positive. I know of a man who had his house burnt down when they found out he got HIV. I know of various families that have had to move across the country. I know of families that won't even discuss it today. And even today, their friends and relatives think that the person who died of cancer, because cancer is acceptable, isn't it? If you've got cancer, you get all the sympathy and, you know, all the support packages and so on. In those days, there was nothing for HIV. You know, we got the government with their tombstones and don't die of ignorance. We had Edwina Curry, good Christian people don't get AIDS. We had Kenneth Clark saying, well, as only haemophiliacs have died. You know, we were up against it from the start.
Yeah, And no compensation or nothing. You know, it paints a picture of people in different parts of the country all feeling isolated, all feeling, you know, all going through this and not realizing the extent of it. And it was, as I said, it was flagged up in, say, very early on, but still nothing done. So this inquiry has really shone a light on it. And as we started off saying right at the beginning, whereas many people can just turn the page and say, oh yes, that's news. You and your family are an absolute living statistic. What is it? What did it do to you? It's surely the anger would have burnt up, would be burning that, hang on, people knew this was going on. We weren't allowed to talk about it. Was there that anger as well as grief?
Yeah, definitely. That didn't stop me talking about it, by the way. I mean, they didn't want us to. Yeah, good for you. But this was in the days before the internet, when we just relied on the post and phone calls, and then gradually started meeting other victims and their families. And, you know, the support groups we've got today evolved over time. I'm secretary of Tainted Blood, which is the largest campaign group in the country, and it's a fantastic group with fantastic people who have formed what I think will be lifelong friendships through it, you know. But there was nothing in the early days, nothing at all for us. And so we were kind of floundering around in the dark. And yes, I was angry. But it was anger that was directed at people that wouldn't talk to me, that wouldn't give me any answers. And the more that came out about how this product had been made and where it was made and what the alternative treatments were, the safer treatments that they could have had, that makes you angry. Yeah. And that still makes me angry today. And what makes me angry, actually, is the government's continual denial of this. You know, all the evidence is out in the public domain. No, it wasn't, and that's been proved by the inquiry. We did the best we could at the time. No, they didn't, and that's been proved by the public inquiry. They would have bled to death without it, is an absolute classic. No, they wouldn't. Very, very rarely does a haemophiliac bleed to death.
So do you hope that now this public, now that this inquiry has come out and they're going to go ahead and publish the full findings, do you hope that someone somewhere will stand up and you know, well, compensation's one thing. Some people have been, some people haven't, you know, it's very patchy. What do you hope in your wildest dreams that will come of this when everything is finally published?
Do you know what I'd like to see? I think there's something fundamentally wrong in this country. I mean, obviously there's a lot of fundamental issues, but as far as this goes, whenever there's a tragedy or a disaster or whatever it might be, and I'm thinking particularly here of Hillsborough, the victims end up, and think about the Lockerbie bombings, the victims end up fighting and battling against the perpetrators of whatever went wrong. In the case of Hillsborough, it was the police, it was the FA, and to an extent it was the press. Now, I think it's gone on too long. I mean, we've spent 40 years fighting against the government, against the pharmaceutical companies, and you know, what a ridiculous waste of people's lives that is. Why can't we have an independent body set up to deal with these problems as they arise? Things will always go wrong somewhere along the line. Yeah. But why do those victims then have to go to the people who did it to them, who made the mistakes or who did this, you know, this wrongdoing, and then plead for justice? They're not going to get justice there, are they?
Thank you. Sue, you make a really, really good point. Why heap extra trauma on the victims when they're going through the toughest time, when they have to be the ones that they make wrongs right, so to speak. Sue, thank you so much for your time. And I'm still very sorry for your loss. And I'm so glad that you didn't shut up, as you say. Wow. Well, let's hope. Well, let's not turn the page. Be so quickly to turn the page. Let's stay on top of this. Sue Threakall there, who's personally affected by the infected blood scandal. Back with more in just a moment.